Avengers Endgame wrapped up a decade of character development, storylines, and major world-changing events in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but it left some audience members scratching their heads trying to figure everything out. There was a lot of time traveling that took place in the movie, which complicated things. Many viewers had trouble keeping up with all the time jumps or had no idea what actually happened to Loki, among other things. It's time to break down the time travel mechanics of Endgame, and also take a look at how it could impact Marvel movies from Phase 4 and beyond. Many viewers who watched Avengers Endgame did their best to try and put together the often confusing timeline presented in the movie. Now, the timeline of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is something that has been hotly contested among fans for some time. Even Marvel Studios has made its fair share of mistakes on more than one occasion, like when the title card of Spider-Man Homecoming said the movie took place 8 years following the Battle of New York from the Avengers, which took place in 2012. Which would have put Homecoming in 2020, or 2 years following Avengers Infinity War. Endgame sought to confirm certain dates once and for all, but in a movie where a lot of the plot is driven by time travel, that gets complicated quite quickly. Despite what Homecoming led viewers to believe, Endgame confirmed that the events of Infinity War happened in the year 2018. That is when the decimation happened, wiping out half of all life in the universe and stranding Scott Lang in the quantum realm as seen in the mid-credits scene of Ant-Man and the Wasp. It starts out following the events of Infinity War, which left Tony Stark and Nebula on Titan after their companions were decimated. Although they managed to travel through space via the Benatar, it just wasn't enough for them to make it to safety. The ship sustained damage during the Battle of Titan and quickly ran out of essential supplies like food and oxygen, leaving our heroes in mortal peril. But thankfully, Captain Marvel popped up just in time to ensure Tony Stark would see many more sunrises, and escorted him and Nebula safely back to Earth. Although Tony was safe, his morale was pretty low to say the least, and after fighting with Steve Rogers, he decided to sit out the remaining Avengers' first attempt to undo the decimation by confronting Thanos. After the Avengers have their initial reunion with Thanos in Endgame, the movie skips ahead 5 years, leaving us in the year 2023. That is when a heroic rat saved Scott from the quantum realm so he could bring the idea of time travel and the resources of the decimated Hank Pym to people far smarter than himself. That is when things start to get really tricky. Smart Hulk and Tony Stark, who is now on board with undoing the decimation, manage to figure out how to travel through time. In broad strokes, their plan is pretty simple. Travel back to important moments in the MCU timeline and collect the Infinity Stones, bringing them back to present-day 2023 and using them to undo the decimation. A team consisting of Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, Smart Hulk, and Scott Lang head back to the Battle of New York, which, as we mentioned earlier, takes place in the year 2012, or 11 years prior to present-day MCU. Captain America is both able to reclaim the scepter containing the Mind Stone and delight comic book fans with his Hail Hydra reference fairly easily. Bruce Banner receives the Time Stone from the Ancient One after going through a lesson on the dangers of time travel that we'll talk about in more depth later. At first, she's resistant to handing it over and smacks Smart Hulk right into Bruce Banner when he tries to take it. Ultimately, what manages to convince her is the fact that Bruce reveals Doctor Strange gave up the Time Stone to save Tony Stark. At this time in 2012, Doctor Strange was still a surgeon and not a sorcerer, but the Ancient One clearly knew who he was. Before she perished during the Doctor Strange movie, she admitted she had looked into the future but couldn't see past her own demise. So she really put all of her eggs in the Doctor Strange basket. Things are ultimately resolved peacefully with the Ancient One, but when Tony and Scott try to get the Tesseract, things took a turn for the worse. The Tesseract contains the Space Stone that can transport the user away from their current location whether they want to leave or not. Despite their best efforts, Tony and Scott not only fail to obtain the Tesseract, but it ends up in the hands of Loki, who promptly uses it to disappear. Where is Loki, or perhaps more accurately, when is Loki, was the question on almost everyone's mind. And we'll talk about what happened to the God of Mischief later, but in the meantime, let's continue with the Endgame timeline since Loki never reappears at any point in the movie. Following Loki's disappearance, Scott and Smart Hulk travel back to present-day 2023 with the Time Stone and Mind Stone they were able to obtain. Tony and Steve, however, decide to run a Hail Mary by going even further back in time. despite the fact that this venture will use up the last of their Pym particles, potentially leaving them stranded in the past. The two travel back in time to April 7th, 1970, which is about a month before Tony would be born to Howard and Maria Stark. Tony takes care of retrieving the Tesseract and shares some heartwarming moments with his father, who's unaware that he's talking to the future version of his own son. Meanwhile, Steve takes care of obtaining more Pym particles and catches a glimpse of his beloved Peggy Carter. Their mission complete, the two Avengers head back to present-day 2023. Another group of heroes also traveled back in time, but not quite as far as the Battle of New York. Rhodey, Nebula, Clint Barton, and Natasha Romanoff all go back to the year 2014, which is when the events of the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie took place. Rhodey and Nebula are tasked with getting the Power Stone from Morag before Peter Quill can grab it. And Clint and Natasha go to Vormir for the Soul Stone. While Natasha had to sacrifice herself for the Soul Stone, the rest of the mission goes pretty smoothly on Vormir, and Clint is able to return to 2023 with the Soul Stone. However, things don't quite go as well in the quest for the Power Stone. 2023 Nebula ends up getting captured by the 2014 versions of Gamora and Thanos. At this time in 2014, they were also looking for the Power Stone, and the neural network of 2014 Nebula connects to the 2023 Nebula, allowing Thanos to access her memories. The version of Gamora we see here has not yet met Peter Quill, or any other members of the Guardians of the Galaxy. 2014 Nebula takes 2023 Nebula's place among the heroes in the present and tries to blend in to obtain all the Infinity Stones. While 2014 Nebula heads to the present, the 2014 Thanos and Gamora, along with their prisoner 2023 Nebula, aren't far behind. Comparatively, Rocket and Thor have a pretty smooth trip back in time to 2013 when Thor: The Dark World takes place. Thor ends up having a heart-to-heart with his mother moments before her death, and ends up reuniting with Mjolnir while Rocket manages to get the Reality Stone before the two return to 2023. After the decimation is undone, 2014 Thanos takes on our heroes while 2023 Nebula confronts 2014 Nebula. 2023 Nebula manages to say goodbye to her old self, destroying 2014 Nebula. Once Thanos and his minions are defeated by Tony Stark, this leaves the fate of 2014 Gamora up in the air. At the end of the movie, we see Thor getting ready for an adventure with the Guardians of the Galaxy and Nebula, but Gamora remains conspicuously absent. In a way, when Thanos announced that he was inevitable, he wasn't wrong. The decimation definitely happened, and while the Avengers were able to undo it, that doesn't change the fact that it occurred. Half of all life in the universe disappeared in the blink of an eye, and our heroes were helpless to stop it from happening. When Doctor Strange looked at all of those possible futures, he knew the decimation had to happen, because stopping Thanos was genuinely impossible. The only option the Avengers had was undoing the decimation once it had already occurred. No matter how many times the Avengers went back in time, there was no way to stop Thanos from wiping out half of all life in the universe on this timeline. Of course, Thanos and his army were eventually taken out by Tony Stark, who let out one more "I am Iron Man" before snapping his fingers and sacrificing himself for the greater good. Meanwhile, Steve Rogers set off to return the Infinity Stones to their rightful places from where the heroes collected them earlier in the movie. That way, the alternate timelines that were formed by their disappearances won't be doomed. And Bruce Banner made good on his promise to the Ancient One, but Steve Rogers doesn't come back right away. Instead, he lives out his life with Peggy Carter and ends up retiring in 2023, passing his shield along to Sam Wilson. But although Steve went back in time in order to prevent alternate timelines from being doomed to despair, it's possible things weren't left quite as they should be. Before getting into the idea of alternate timelines and the impact Endgame had on the multiverse, it's time to explain how time travel works in the MCU. Time travel in Endgame works much differently than in other time travel movies, like Back to the Future, for example. In that franchise, interfering in the past affects the present day, but in the MCU, things work much differently when it comes to moving through time. Essentially, no matter how badly someone messes up the past, it can't impact the future. The butterfly effect doesn't exist in the MCU, which can be confusing because it goes against what a lot of pop culture has told us about time travel. Just think about how the Avengers went back in time to collect the Infinity Stones. If time travel worked in a linear way, this would have prevented Thanos from ever getting his hands on them and causing the decimation in the first place. But that didn't happen. Even though the Avengers snatched up the Infinity Stones before Thanos could on this timeline, Thanos still got them and caused the decimation, meaning our heroes had to use the Infinity Stones to undo it. Rhodey suggested going back in time and taking out Thanos when he was a baby, but in addition to the moral quandary of that scenario, it wouldn't actually improve their situation in this version of 2023. That's because unlike in Back to the Future, taking the stones didn't impact the present day on this one particular timeline we're following the Avengers on. The real problem occurs on other timelines. When Bruce Banner tries to get the Time Stone from the Ancient One, she's understandably reluctant to hand it over. But it isn't because it's an ancient and unimaginably powerful artifact. It's actually because Bruce is a total stranger to her. She explains that removing an Infinity Stone from its proper place in time would create a brand new alternate timeline. And without an Infinity Stone, the future of that timeline would be in bad shape. If she gives up the Time Stone, Doctor Strange wouldn't be able to use it to fight against Caecilius and Dormammu in the new timeline in 2016 when the Doctor Strange movie takes place. This is the reason why Steve goes back in time to put the Infinity Stones back where they belong. He does so in order to prevent a host of doomed alternate timelines from popping up. When talking about the concept of time travel, we heard Tony Stark mention the name David Deutsch. David Deutsch is a physicist who came up with the many worlds theory, or the multiverse theory. Essentially, this means that our universe is just one of many parallel universes. Changing something in the past doesn't affect your main timeline, but it causes a new timeline to branch out. Tony also throws out some more concepts like the Planck scale, eigenvalues, and the EPR paradox, which are all important theories that revolve around time travel. One of the most popular theories ever created is Einstein's theory of special relativity. According to this theory, space and time exist in a single continuum. Space has three axes, x, y, and z, which is why objects exist in 3 dimensions. This means the space-time continuum exists in 4 dimensions, 3 for space and 1 for time. It's possible to flatten a 3D object into 2 dimensions. Just think about drawing a 2D picture of a globe. So therefore, it's possible to represent space-time in 2 dimensions as well. This is something we saw Tony running simulations of using a Mobius strip, which is a 3D shape with a single side. Using quantum tunnels, Tony is then able to move from point A to point B along this version of the space-time continuum. Although this is a new thing for the MCU, it's something comic book fans are quite familiar with. The main comic book universe is Earth 616, also known as Earth Prime, and it's where many of the comic book storylines take place. But it's not any more real than any of the other universes. For instance, Earth 1610 is the ultimate Marvel universe, and it's just as valid as Earth 616. In Spider-Man Far From Home, Quentin Beck claims to be from Earth 833, which was a universe in the comic books before it was destroyed. This universe was the home of William Braddock, or Spider-UK, a combination of Spider-Man and Captain Britain. In the comic books, these universes can be destroyed or worse. There's also Earth 2149, where a zombie plague takes over humanity, so it's clear why the Ancient One was so hesitant to create an alternate timeline by allowing Bruce to take the Time Stone. She doesn't want any timeline to end up like Earth 833 or Earth 2149 in the comics. We know this can get a bit confusing, but perhaps the best example of the lack of a butterfly effect in the MCU is the fact that present-day Nebula takes herself out and yet still manages to exist. If the MCU was playing by other rules, 2023 Nebula destroying 2014 Nebula would have caused 2023 Nebula to cease to exist. Yet she's very much alive at the end of the movie. As Hulk explains in the film, if you travel to the past, that past becomes your future, and your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future. Going back in time to take out Thanos as a baby would not only be a morally questionable act, but it wouldn't impact the main MCU timeline. It would just make a new one in which Thanos doesn't exist. That new timeline wouldn't help undo the decimation on the main MCU timeline. So Steve Rogers going back in time to put the Infinity Stones where they belong should have wrapped up the multiverse and fixed all their problems. This act would have prevented alternate timelines from developing and moved everyone towards a future where the decimation was undone and the day was saved. But there's just one problem with this. When Tony Stark and Steve Rogers first met in the Avengers, Steve accused Tony of being selfish and unwilling to sacrifice himself for others. This made it pretty interesting when Tony sacrificed his life to defeat Thanos in Endgame, and Steve risked the future of his timeline for his own wants. Steve did manage to put all the Infinity Stones back in their rightful places, along with Thor's hammer Mjolnir, but he also inserted himself back into a life he had long left behind. Steve Rogers was born on July 4, 1918, and during the year 1945 he made his fateful plunge into the Arctic, which we saw during Captain America: The First Avenger. He remained frozen for 66 years until he was thawed out in 2011. Prior to being frozen, Steve was romantically involved with S.H.I.E.L.D. co-founder Peggy Carter. But after being frozen for over a half a century, Peggy had no choice but to move on with her life. In Captain America: The Winter Soldier, we learned Peggy had indeed moved on after Steve was presumed deceased. She had gotten married and had 2 children, although the identity of her husband was never revealed, even at her funeral. According to a video at the Captain America exhibit, she was married to a man who was saved by none other than Steve Rogers. And when Steve visits her when she's suffering from Alzheimer's, we see pictures of her kids, but none of her husband. In the movie Ant-Man, there was a flashback to the year 1989, featuring a very angry Hank Pym confronting Howard Stark. We also see Peggy Carter, who's wearing what looks like a wedding band on her left hand. We saw Peggy and Steve finally share their dance together at the end of Endgame, but it was left semi-ambiguous whether Steve was the mysterious husband of Peggy Carter all along, as well as the father of her children. According to Endgame writer Stephen McFeely, he had always intended for Steve to somehow be the father of Peggy's children, and the time travel discovered in Endgame just made it possible. Some fans believe this goes against the time travel rules established in the movie, and Steve should have created an alternate timeline when he went back in time to be with Peggy. This would have caused Peggy to have a different husband and kids on the main timeline, compared to the alternative one where she marries and has children with Steve. But since McFeely clarified that Steve was always the father of Peggy's children, this means this all happened on the same timeline, which raises its own set of questions. It may seem like as happy of an ending as anyone can have in the MCU, but there are no shortage of issues that come with Steve being Peggy's secret husband all this time. If this all happened on the main timeline, that means there have been 2 versions of Steve Rogers all this time. While that might not have been as big of a deal when one of them was frozen in the ice, what about when he was freed? What was 2023 Steve Rogers doing during the Battle of New York or the infamous airport fight? How did Steve manage to keep his identity a secret all those years when he was married to Peggy? And if Steve has 2 biological children, does that mean there are 2 more superpowered humans out there in the MCU? After all, the super soldier serum really changed Steve, so it doesn't seem impossible that it could have impacted his children as well. At least this all explains why there was a picture of Steve on Peggy's desk when he and Tony traveled back to 1970 in Avengers Endgame. At this time, Peggy would be about 50 years old, which means she would have gotten married and had her children already. So if she married anyone other than Steve Rogers, it would be rather odd for her to have a picture of her old boyfriend on her desk. At the end of Endgame, we see a 1940s-style car, so it seems like Steve ended up at some point between 1947, when Agent Carter ended, and 1953 when she was married per the Smithsonian footage we saw in The Winter Soldier. If Steve had returned from the future to the 1940s, he would have known all about himself visiting Peggy and attending her funeral, which means he would have known when to make himself scarce to avoid confusion. This could explain why the 2 Steves didn't encounter one another and why Peggy only had photos of her children and not her husband. This leaves us with questions about Steve Rogers' relationship with Peggy's niece, Sharon Carter. But the version of Steve that shared a kiss with Sharon Carter didn't know he was going to end up going back in time and marrying Sharon's aunt. It's possible Sharon knew Peggy's husband as an older man and didn't recognize that he's the same person as the young Steve Rogers she encountered. But Steve Rogers isn't the only person whose Avengers Endgame antics have audiences asking questions about what's going on with the multiverse. At the end of Avengers Endgame, viewers were left wondering about the fate of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The following film to be released, and the final one in Phase 3, was Spider-Man: Far From Home, which took place shortly following the events of Endgame. But Phase 4 is not just going to be made up of exciting feature films. Disney is rolling out a whole new streaming platform for their fans. Disney Plus will have exclusive shows featuring your favorite Marvel characters, including one of them whose fate left fans scratching their heads in Endgame. As we mentioned earlier, Tony Stark and Scott Lang saw Loki in the aftermath of the Battle of New York when they were trying to retrieve the Tesseract. Loki ended up getting away with the Tesseract and disappeared to parts unknown, never to be seen again in the movie. But don't forget, this isn't the most recent version of Loki we've seen in the MCU, who has grown and evolved over the years. This is the Loki who tried to usurp the throne of Asgard in the movie Thor, and then tried to steal the Tesseract for Thanos in the Avengers. He'd never escaped from prison in Thor: The Dark World, ruled Asgard in disguise as Odin, or redeemed himself in Thor: Ragnarok. That Loki is gone for good. He met his end at the hands of Thanos in Avengers Infinity War. But the 2012 Loki who grabbed the Tesseract and disappeared is still alive. He did exactly what the Ancient One warned Bruce Banner about by taking an Infinity Stone and not putting it back, messing with the space-time continuum. There's a chance 2018-era Loki would have had enough empathy to be concerned about this, but not 2012 Loki. According to actor Tom Hiddleston, Loki is still the same guy who just got smashed by the Hulk in the Avengers. Endgame director Joe Russo has since confirmed what many fans suspected, which is that Loki created another timeline in the movie. According to Joe, even the mighty Captain America wouldn't be able to correct this course when he went back in time to return the Infinity Stones. To do that, he would have to find Loki, who has an Infinity Stone and a new branch of reality to play in. Even if Cap hadn't retired with his love Peggy Carter, that would be a tall order. Fortunately for Marvel fans, Loki will be one of the characters who's going to be featured on Disney+. Loki will be premiering in 2021 and will feature the version of the trickster god who we saw take off with the Tesseract in Endgame. Although there's no definite date yet, it'll premiere sometime between the debut of the movie Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness and the What If anthology series. Although little is known about the show, one persistent rumor has been that it will involve Loki traveling to notable events throughout history. This seems to tie in with the idea that Loki is on an alternate timeline where he'll remain, at least for now. That way, Loki can leave his mark on the world without messing things up for the main MCU timeline. One early image of the show features Loki standing in front of a billboard for the movie Jaws, which was released in 1975. This could tie into the idea that Loki is going to find a way to travel through time. But while Loki's off on new adventures, there's another MCU member whose fate is even more uncertain. During the big announcement of Marvel's Phase 4 lineup, there was one highly anticipated entry missing. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is a movie fans have been eagerly awaiting for quite some time. And considering how up in the air Gamora's fate seemed at the end of Endgame, anticipation for the film is only rising. Many fans were beginning to wonder if it would ever happen without James Gunn, who directed the first 2 flicks in the franchise. When some questionable tweets from long ago surfaced, Disney fired the director, much to the dismay of the Guardians cast and crew. In addition to upsetting the talent, the decision also scared away any other potential directors from the project. Thor Ragnarok director Taika Waititi said he wouldn't even consider touching a project which so thoroughly belonged to another director. It really seemed like Disney was backed into a corner if they ever wanted to get a third Guardians movie out. They ended up rehiring James Gunn, but there was just one problem. This famous director had already moved on and was signed on to direct the second Suicide Squad movie and wouldn't be able to work on Guardians until that was finished. So while the third movie won't be happening during Phase 4, it's one step closer to appearing in theaters. I'm happy to have my captain back because we were panicking. Actress Zoe Saldana, who plays Gamora, has expressed joy and relief that James Gunn is back on the project. But fans want to know what the future for Gamora holds. Like Loki, Gamora was one of the characters who lost their lives prior to the decimation in Avengers Infinity War. Her father Thanos threw her off a cliff on Vormir in order to obtain the Soul Stone, and she didn't return when the decimation was undone in Endgame. But while the present-day Gamora is long gone, the big question was whether or not the one from 2014 was still alive. Nearly 3 months after the release of the film, Endgame writers Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely confirmed that Gamora did survive Tony Stark's snap, but that she quickly ran off. In the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie, 2014 Gamora makes her vehement anti-Thanos stance quite clear, and this is apparent in Endgame as well. She takes the side of her sister Nebula and does what she can to bring down the Mad Titan, even though this version of the character has no memory of defeating Ronan the Accuser or joining the Guardians. While Gamora might not remember them, they definitely remember her, especially Peter Quill, who seems to be trying to pinpoint her location during his final scene in Endgame. Keep in mind that this version of Gamora is now free from the threat of Thanos and hasn't developed the close bonds of friendship she did since joining the Guardians. While Zoe Saldana has talked about being happy James Gunn is back on the project, she's been much more secretive about whether or not she'll appear in the third installment of the franchise. Even though he was missing in action for most of the movie, Doctor Strange played a critical role in making sure everything went as planned in Endgame. When we saw him during Infinity War, he looked at 14,605 possible futures only to find a single one where our heroes were able to triumph over Thanos. Doctor Strange also shared the title of the fourth Avengers movie when he uttered the now iconic line, "We're in the Endgame now." At the time, the line was a bit more ambiguous, but Endgame screenwriters Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely have since cleared things up. When Doctor Strange saw the possible futures, he also saw Tony Stark's demise and knew that he would be the key to reversing the decimation. That was the reason why he gave the Time Stone to Thanos in order to save Tony, despite saying earlier in the movie that he would let Tony perish in such a situation. In fact, the situation was so precarious that Doctor Strange couldn't even tell Tony what he had to do during the final Endgame battle, or he risked it not happening. Although he was absent for most of the movie, Doctor Strange was an important character in Endgame nonetheless, and his impact on the multiverse seems to be just beginning. A sequel to 2016's Doctor Strange will be part of the Phase 4 lineup, and it'll also tie into the Disney Plus streaming show WandaVision. Director Scott Derrickson is returning for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which is set to hit theaters in May 2021. Not only will Benedict Cumberbatch be reprising his role as Doctor Strange, but Elizabeth Olsen will also be appearing as the Scarlet Witch. Like most of the films in Marvel's Phase 4, the details about this one are sparse, but it's fair to assume that Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness will involve the multiverse in some capacity. To make the upcoming film even more tantalizing, Scott Derrickson tweeted a panel from the Infinity Saga, where Doctor Strange enters a realm outside of space and time. There's also the intriguing fact that this movie will impact WandaVision, a show that will feature not only the Scarlet Witch, but Vision as well. Yes, Vision did perish twice in Infinity War, and he didn't return when the decimation was undone during Endgame. Between magic, time travel, and the fact that Vision isn't human, there are seemingly endless ways he could be brought back for the show. But fans will have to wait and see exactly how it happens. What fans do know is that another Marvel character will appear, and she's going to go through quite a time skip since we last saw her. The movie Captain Marvel takes place in the year 1995. Carol Danvers catches up with her old friend Maria Rambeau, who has a young daughter named Monica, played by Akira Akbar. Monica Rambeau will be in WandaVision, but she'll be played by adult actress Teyonah Parris. While Marvel hasn't clued fans in on exactly when WandaVision will take place or what part of the multiverse it'll be in, the fact that it involves a grown-up Monica helps to narrow it down. Fans are eager to know where the rest of the Phase 4 movies will fit into the MCU timeline, and the extent of the impact Endgame will have on the lineup. Considering Natasha Romanoff sacrificed herself in Endgame, it's not surprising that the Black Widow movie set to be released in 2020 is going to take place prior to Endgame. The movie will take place following the events of Captain America: Civil War, when Black Widow sided with Cap regarding the Sokovia Accords and subsequently became a fugitive. The Eternals will also come out in 2020, and since the titular characters are immortal, the options for when the movie takes place are limitless. Still, the film promises to fill in many gaps in MCU history, particularly the story of the Celestials. Viewers have seen a few of them in the MCU so far, but little is known about them in the roles they've played in the cosmic history of the MCU. Marvel Studios head Kevin Feige said he's interested in the ancient aliens kind of sci-fi trope, and retroactively explaining history through this movie. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is an upcoming Phase 4 movie that's much more difficult to fit into the timeline. It'll definitely involve the real Mandarin and not the fake one from Iron Man 3. According to Kevin Feige, the real Mandarin has been lurking around the MCU, and he's not very happy with being impersonated. This makes it sound like the movie takes place at some point after the third Iron Man movie. The events of that film take place 7 months following the Battle of New York from the Avengers. Thor: Love and Thunder is a movie that definitely takes place at some point post-Avengers Endgame, meaning it starts in 2023 at the earliest. Tessa Thompson will be reprising the role of Valkyrie, the first LGBTQ hero in the MCU, and will be ruling over New Asgard, which Thor left her in charge of at the end of Endgame. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier show will also take place at some point after Endgame, as Sam Wilson adjusts to becoming the new Captain America following Steve Rogers' retirement. Many fans assume the Hawkeye show will as well, since it involves Clint Barton training the new Hawkeye, Kate Bishop. Although comic book fans are familiar with Kate, we haven't seen her in the MCU yet. Since Clint took on his Ronin persona in Endgame, this also seems to indicate that the Hawkeye show will take place during or after 2023. It's hard to say what will happen in Marvel's Phase 4 and beyond, but it's clear Endgame has changed the game. Avengers Endgame marked the end of the Infinity Saga, but just because this story is over doesn't mean the MCU isn't still going strong. It remains to be seen what the far-reaching implications of this milestone of cinema will be as we enter Phase 4 and beyond. What do you think about the way the multiverse and time travel could impact the MCU? Do you want to see more of these plot devices, or do you think they're just too much? Tell us what you think in the comments section below, and then click on the subscribe button for more videos from us here at CBR. Bye for now.